Good day everyone and welcome to our last lesson in CM011. This is all about polymer chemistry. In this lesson, we will be talking about the common polymers such as plastics, rubbers, and natural polymers that are in our everyday lives. And we will also be talking a bit about the mechanisms on how they are formed. Let's start with a broad definition of polymer. So we define a polymer as a large molecule composed of a chain of repeating units called monomers. So if you compare polymers to Legos, the individual Lego pieces are your monomers and the finished product or the finished piece is called the polymer, okay? Monomers are typically small molecules, but if you form them together into a chain, then you form a big macromolecule called a polymer. Now, polymers are now very common in our lives, especially because all plastics you see around you are polymers. Also included in that list of polymers are rubbers, and even plants and animals, and even you are composed of polymers. Okay? We generally have two types of polymers. Those are the addition and condensation polymers. We will be discussing both of those types of polymers in this lesson. Let's start with addition polymers. Monomers are merely added to form a chain and no other products are formed besides the polymer. So for addition polymers, you are simply adding monomers together without any other product except the polymer itself. A very good example of an addition polymer is polyethylene or PE. It is formed by the polymerization of ethylene molecules. In this instance, ethylene is our monomer and polyethylene is our polymer. Okay? This is the Lewis structure of polyethylene. You see that it is a continuous chain of ethylene molecules. This is one ethylene molecule. Ethylene is C2H4. So you see here that the two linked carbon atoms here compose of one monomer. So we have here one monomer, another monomer, and so on and so forth until you form a very long molecule of your polymer. Okay? Now, polyethylene is one of the most common plastics we have, and it exists in different forms. We have HDPE, or high-density polyethylene. It's called high-density polyethylene because your polyethylene chains are very long and are straight, meaning that those straight chains can stack together to form dense structures. Okay? HDPE is often used for applications which require the rigidity of the plastic. Another form of polyethylene is LDPE or low density polyethylene. This happens when your chain of polyethylene gets broken down and forms branches. Okay? In HDPE, your polymer is linear. It has no branches. That's why it has a high density. For LDPE, you are forming branches. Therefore, you are forming a plastic that has a relatively low density. That's why it's called low density polyethylene. Okay? These types of plastics are flexible. They are trading rigidity for flexibility. Another type of polyethylene is CLPE or cross-linked polyethylene. In this case, you still have a very big molecule of polyethylene, but now you have a mixture between straight structures and branched structures. Okay? Cross-linked polyethylene or CLPE shares the properties of HDPE and LDPE. Here are other types of addition polymers. So we have polypropylene, you might be familiar with this, or PP, polyvinyl chloride or PVC. This should be familiar to you because this is the main material used in plastic tubing. So we have PVC pipes, okay? Polyacrylonitrile or PAN, polystyrene or PS. Polystyrene is more commonly known for its trade name styrofoam. So polystyrene can either be styrofoam, wherein it is used as a packaging material because it can absorb shocks, or it can also be used as a rigid plastic if there is no injection of air. If you notice, styrofoam is very light and is very fluffy. That's because you have infused very small air bubbles inside of the matrix of your polystyrene. If there are no air bubbles, polystyrene would be a very rigid plastic, which is applied in some applications that require both rigidity and transparency. Another example, we have PVA or polyvinyl acetate. Polyvinyl acetate is more commonly known for being used in glue. PVA is used in white glue or white school glue. It is also used in wood glue and other types of glue. Okay, PVA is soluble in water. Next, we have polymethyl methacrylates. This is also called as acrylic glass or more commonly known as the trade name plexiglass. This material is famous for being a very good substitute to glass. Okay, it is transparent, but it is not brittle. However, the problem with acrylic is it's very easily scratched. You can find polymethyl methacrylate in some shatterproof windows, in some special roofings for greenhouses, and even in some aquariums. And finally, we have polytetrafluoroethylene or PTFE. You better know this as its trade name Teflon. Okay? Teflon is a trade name for PTFE. So PTFE is used in applications wherein a polymer that does not react or an inert polymer is needed, such as for non-stick pans. The non-stick covering in non-stick pans is actually PTFE. It is a hydrophobic molecule, and with that, it repels water. Okay? It helps with the non-stick properties of the non-stick pan. You can also find PTFE as linings of some tubes if you don't want the liquid that is inside of the tube to react with the tube. Okay? Next, let's go to copolymerization. So when we say copolymerization, you no longer have one monomer for the entire polymer. As we have mentioned earlier, a polymer is simply a long chain consisting of a repeating unit of monomers. When we say copolymerization, it's now possible to have two or more different monomers that are the repeating units of your polymer. A very good example of that is synthetic rubber. Please do take note that we have two types of rubber, the natural and synthetic rubber. For synthetic rubber, one of the most common is called styrene butadiene rubber or SBR. It's called that way because styrene and butadiene are your two monomers that are being repeated in copolymerization. Okay, so we have here the structure of 1,3-butadiene, one of your monomers, and styrene, the other of your monomers. Please do take note that styrene is your monomer in polystyrene. So we see here that if we combine styrene with another monomer such as butadiene, the resulting polymer would have very different properties from that of the pure styrene. If you get pure polystyrene, you get a very rigid plastic. But if you combine styrene with butadiene in this case, you will get a very strong rubber. So it's both flexible and strong. From the stoichiometry of the reaction, you see that you need 3 monomers of butadiene and 1 monomer of styrene to form one big monomer structure for SBR or styrene butadiene rubber. That means that your repeating structure for SBR consists of butadiene, styrene, and butadiene. So if you repeat this chain over and over again, then you get styrene butadiene rubber. That is how copolymerization works. The next class of polymers are called condensation polymers. So again, we have two types of synthetic polymers. We have the addition and condensation polymers. For condensation polymers, you are producing a byproduct from the polymerization reaction. An example of that is polyesters. You might have already heard of the term polyester because the term polyester is often used for clothing. Okay, if you take a look at the tag of your shirts, it might say polycotton or 70% polyester and 30% cotton. The 70% polyester there is a product of condensation polymerization. For condensation polymerization, usually you have a byproduct. In this case, the byproduct is water. Okay, that's why it's called condensation because you are forming another product besides your main polymer. Shown here is the formation of PET or polyethylene terephthalate. You are familiar with PET because it is commonly used in disposable bottled water or in soft drinks. PET is formed by the copolymerization, condensation copolymerization of terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol. Here we have the terephthalic acid and here we have your ethylene glycol. So let's now characterize the common plastics that we have lying around our house or in our environment. We have here the classification of plastics. So common plastics have a number code to easily identify them in consumer products. So with this lesson, the hope is you would be better equipped in identifying the plastics that you are using in your everyday lives because the information and awareness would greatly help us in the recycling of these plastics. These are the numbers that you find inside triangular recycle signs such as shown in here. Normally, if you take a look at the bottom of a plastic container, you would see one of these signs. And these numbers would help us to identify what type of plastic is used in that product. And in turn, we could help in segregating those plastic products because each of these numbers should be recycled separately. They cannot be mixed together or else the resulting product would be of inferior quality. Okay? Number 1 is PET or PETE. That's what we call polyethylene terephthalate. This is the material that is commonly used in beverages. So you have your bottled water, bottled juices, bottled soft drinks, etc. Okay? If you take a look at the bottom of those plastic bottles, you would see this sign, number 1. Okay? But please take note that the cap of the bottle and the body of the bottle are different materials. Normally, the cap of the bottle is made of polypropylene. That's number 5. So the cap of the bottle and the body of the bottle are to be recycled separately. They are not to be mixed. Okay? That is a very good information for you to know. Next, number 2, we have HDPE or high density polyethylene. HDPE is normally used in tubings. So you can also find plastic tubes or plastic piping that is HDPE and not PVC. But you can also find HDPE in some containers of consumer products such as bottles of shampoo, bottles of liquid soap, etc., wherein we don't need the transparency of PET. If you notice, all of your PET bottles are transparent because we want to showcase the products inside. For HDPE, it's very hard to produce a very clear HDPE, and in some applications, we don't want the bottle to be clear, okay? It might be that the product is photosensitive, or it might be that you don't want the consumers to see the color of the products. So those are the applications of HDPE. Next, number 3, we have PVC or polyvinyl chloride. PVC is most commonly known for being used in pipes and tubes, but it would also surprise you that PVC can also be used for plastic mats, such as for linings in walls and in floors. Next, number 4, we have low-density polyethylene or LDPE. Since LDPE is more flexible and is not rigid compared to HDPE, you would find that the number one application of LDPE are for plastic bags. So the plastic bags that we use are commonly made of LDPE. Other products that are made of LDPE are flexible bottles, such as for some laboratory apparatus, as well as for transparent plastic sheets that are used for packaging in the industry. Next, number 5, we have polypropylene. Polypropylene can also be used in some plastic materials such as plastic cups, Tupperwares, plastic sheets, plastic bags, plastic chairs, and a wide variety of other products, okay? Number 6, we have polystyrene. As we have discussed earlier, polystyrene is more commonly known as styrofoam. But besides styrofoam, polystyrene, if it's not injected with air to form styrofoam, it can also be used as a rigid plastic that is being used in the cover of CDs or DVDs, and it is also used in some casings for CPUs, okay? Because it's very rigid. And finally, we have number 7 or other. While we may have thousands and thousands of different plastic types, we cannot give all of them a defining number because that would be very impractical, okay? So we have here the 6 most commonly used or the 6 largely used plastic polymers that were given their own identification number. Everything else gets lumped together into number 7 or others, okay? It might be that it's not practical to recycle them because of the very low quantity that is being produced or that their quality deteriorates upon recycling. So again, here we have the classification of the common plastics. Let's now move to biopolymers. So biopolymers are naturally occurring polymers in contrast to what we have previously discussed, which are artificial polymers. These biopolymers are what makes up all of living creatures. And these are mainly composed of carbohydrates and proteins. Let's start with carbohydrates. You might have already heard of the term monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, no? Monosaccharides are simply the monomers of the carbohydrates. This is one sugar unit per molecule. These are what we call the simple sugars. Examples of monosaccharides or simple sugars are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Next, we have disaccharides, wherein you have two simple sugars that are linked together to form a sugar molecule containing two simple sugars. Common examples of disaccharides are sucrose and lactose. Sucrose is commonly known as table sugar. This is what you use for your coffee and for your desserts. And lactose is the sugar found in milk. And finally, we have polysaccharides. Polysaccharides is a very diverse group of sugars that include many repeating sugar units. So if you take a simple sugar, let's say for example glucose, and then repeat that over and over such that glucose is your monomer, then you would end up with a polysaccharide, which is our polymer. A very good example of a polysaccharide is cellulose. Cellulose is made of repeating glucose units, but it's a very, very, very long chain of glucose. And you can commonly find cellulose in the cell walls of plants. Cellulose is the reason why plants can stand. It's the reason why plants have the rigidity that they have, okay? Another example of a polysaccharide is starch. Although starch is a smaller or a shorter version of cellulose, starch is what is being used by plants to store their energy. As we all know, plants can produce glucose from photosynthesis, but if they are not intending to use that glucose immediately, they can form starches, which are combinations of glucose molecules to store their energy. Carbohydrates, or more specifically disaccharides and polysaccharides, are formed by condensation polymerization. For example, we have here the formation of maltose from two glucose molecules. You see that upon the combination of two simple sugars, you are forming a disaccharide, which is essentially a polymer, plus water or our byproducts. The linkage between the two simple sugars are what we call glycosidic bonds. Remember the term glycosidic linkage or glycosidic bonds. So if you have two or more simple sugars combined together, the links between them are called glycosidic bonds. Again, this is an example of a polymer carbohydrates or a polysaccharide. Pictured in this example is cellulose. So one of these units is a glucose molecule. So you see here that one glucose molecule is bonded to two other glucose molecules and so on and so forth, such that it forms a chain. And it is this long chain that makes cellulose so difficult to digest. The physical properties of cellulose are very different from the physical properties of its monomer. The monomer of cellulose, which is glucose, is very sweet and is very soluble in water. In contrast, if you have cellulose, which is simply glucose that has been linked together, it is not sweet and it is no longer soluble in water. Okay, so we have physical and chemical changes happening during polymerization. Next, we have proteins. Proteins are also polymers. If you recall, for carbohydrates, the monomers are called simple sugars. For proteins, the monomers are called amino acids. You might have already heard of the term amino acids. So if there are no amino acids, there will be no proteins. And for some of you, when you hear the term proteins, the first thing that comes into mind are animal protein and muscles. But proteins are actually very diverse in their function. It is true that we have proteins in our muscles, and it is true that proteins are what promotes strong muscle growth. But it is also important to take note that proteins are not exclusively found in muscles. In fact, enzymes, which promote a healthy bodily function, are also proteins, and our DNA are also considered as proteins. By the way, amino acids are called as such because the term amino pertains to the amine group that is attached to the alpha carbon, or the main carbon of the amino acid, and the acid part pertains to a carboxylic acid group that is also attached to the carbon. Here are some examples of common amino acids. We have glycine, alanine, valine, and leucine, isoleucine, proline, phenylalanine, methionine, and tryptophan. If you take a look at their structures, they are generally the same structures in that they have the amine group, NH2. If you take a look, all of them have NH2. And also all of them have the carboxylic acid group COOH. So you have here COOH. All of them have the carboxylic acid group. Okay? They only differ in the functional groups that are attached to the alpha carbon. Here are other examples of amino acids. For humans, we have 20 essential amino acids. Okay? These are the amino acids that are found in our body and are serving different functions for our well-being. Similar to carbohydrates, proteins are also formed by condensation polymerization. The only difference between proteins and carbohydrates is that for proteins, you can have many different monomers that are joined together to form a single protein. And a different combinations of the monomers would always result to a different protein. That is the complexity of our human body. It needs the right combination of proteins, and if you mess up even one of the monomers in a protein, then the protein would behave very differently. And that's what results to what we call mutations or abnormalities, okay? For some reason, the gene expression goes wrong, and then a different protein is produced which does not serve the same function as the intended protein. For proteins, the linkage between two monomers are called a peptide linkage or a peptide bond. In contrast, for carbohydrates, we call that a glycosidic bond. Since this is just an introduction to what polymers are, we will no longer perform calculations or stoichiometry for polymers. What is important for you is you know how to identify polymers, whether they are artificial or natural, and you are able to recognize the functions of the polymers. Okay? That's it for this lecture. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep safe.